Master Chen walked through the bustling streets of Bangkok with the confidence of a man who had never tasted defeat. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of breaking boards and conditioning drills, swung loosely at his sides. At 62, he still moved with the fluid grace that had made him a legend in martial arts circles across Southeast Asia. The morning sun cast long shadows as Chen made his way to the royal palace grounds. Today was different from his usual training sessions at the local dojo. Word had spread through the martial arts community like wildfire. The Royal Thai Guard was looking for new combat instructors. The position came with prestige, excellent pay, and most importantly for Chen, the chance to prove that traditional karate could still compete with modern fighting techniques. Chen had spent 45 years perfecting his craft. He began training at 17 under Master Yamamoto in Okinawa, where karate originated. The old Japanese master was ruthless, demanding perfection in every movement, every breath, every thought. Chen remembered the countless hours spent in horse stance until his legs trembled like leaves in a storm. He recalled the meditation sessions that lasted until dawn, teaching him to find inner peace even as his body screamed in agony. After mastering the traditional forms, Chen traveled the world, testing his skills against different fighting styles. He fought Muay Thai champions in Thailand, wrestled with Brazilian jiu-jitsu masters, and even sparred with professional boxers. Each encounter taught him something new, but also reinforced his belief that karate, when practiced with true dedication, was superior to all other martial arts. The palace gates loomed ahead, ornate and imposing. 2 guards in crisp uniforms checked Chen's invitation letter twice before allowing him entry. As he walked through the manicured gardens, Chen noticed other martial artists arriving for the demonstration. There was a tall Russian man who looked like a kickboxer, a compact Brazilian woman with the build of a grappler, and several local Muay Thai fighters whose shin bones looked like iron pipes. Chen felt no intimidation. He had faced crowds before, had demonstrated his skills to skeptical audiences who believed age had weakened him. Time and again he proved them wrong. His speed might have decreased slightly, but his technique had reached a level of perfection that younger fighters could only dream of achieving. The demonstration area was set up in a courtyard surrounded by traditional Thai architecture. Red silk banners fluttered in the breeze, and the sweet scent of jasmine filled the air. About 50 people had gathered to watch: palace officials, current guard members, and what appeared to be foreign dignitaries visiting the kingdom. Chen spotted the man who had to be the royal sentinel immediately. He stood apart from everyone else, wearing a simple black uniform without any decorative elements. The man was perhaps in his 30s, lean but not overly muscular, with eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him without emotion. Unlike the other officials who chatted quietly among themselves, the sentinel remained perfectly still, like a statue waiting for life to be breathed into it. The first demonstration began with the Russian kickboxer. The man was impressive, launching high kicks that whistled through the air and throwing combinations that would have flattened most opponents. The crowd murmured appreciatively, and several officials took notes on clipboards. Chen watched with professional interest but felt no concern. Kickboxing was flashy but lacked the spiritual depth and precision of true karate. Next came the Brazilian woman, who showcased her ground fighting skills with a willing volunteer. She demonstrated various submission holds and escapes, explaining in accented English how each technique could incapacitate an opponent quickly and efficiently. Again, the audience seemed impressed, but Chen knew that a true karate master would never allow himself to be taken to the ground in the first place. The local Muay Thai fighters went through their paces, showing the devastating elbow and knee strikes their art was famous for. They broke boards with their shins, demonstrating conditioning that had taken years to develop. One fighter even broke a baseball bat with a single kick, drawing gasps from the spectators. Through it all, the royal sentinel watched without expression. He didn't applaud when others didn't take notes like the other officials, and didn't engage in conversation with anyone around him. He simply observed, his dark eyes moving from fighter to fighter with the systematic precision of a predator cataloging prey. When Chen's turn came, he walked to the center of the courtyard with measured steps. He wore his traditional white gi, the fabric soft from years of training but still pristine white. His black belt was worn and frayed at the edges, a testament to decades of use. Unlike the other demonstrators who had brought assistants or training partners, Chen stood alone. He began with a traditional bow, deep and respectful, holding it for exactly the right amount of time as his first master had taught him. Then he moved into a kata, a predetermined sequence of movements that told the story of combat against multiple invisible opponents. His body flowed from one technique to the next like water finding its path down a mountainside. The crowd fell silent as Chen demonstrated techniques that were 500 years old, movements perfected by generations of masters before him. His strikes were precise, each one capable of ending a fight instantly if applied to the right target. His blocks flowed seamlessly into counterattacks, showing how karate was not just about offense, but about turning an opponent's aggression against them. For his finale, Chen had arranged for several wooden boards to be set up. Without ceremony or dramatic build-up, he approached them calmly. His first strike was a simple straight punch, but the board exploded into fragments that scattered across the courtyard. The second board fell to a knife-hand strike delivered with surgical precision. The third crumbled under a front kick that moved so fast it was barely visible. The audience erupted in applause, but Chen's eyes were fixed on the royal sentinel. For the first time since Chen had arrived, he saw something flicker across the man's face. It might have been interest or perhaps amusement. The sentinel's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but definitely a reaction. Chen bowed again and stepped back, confident that he had shown everyone present what real martial arts looked like. He had demonstrated not just physical technique, but the spiritual discipline that separated true masters from mere fighters. As he waited for the official response, Chen felt certain that the position was his. The royal sentinel stepped forward as the applause died down. His movement was completely silent, as if his feet barely touched the ground. Chen noticed how the man's balance never shifted, how his center remained perfectly aligned even as he walked. This was someone who understood body mechanics at a deep level. Impressive demonstration. Master Chen, the sentinel said in flawless English, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard without any apparent effort. Your reputation precedes you, and I can see why you've earned such respect in martial arts circles. Chen bowed slightly, accepting the compliment with the grace expected of a master. Inside he felt validated. Recognition from someone of the royal sentinel's obvious. Skill meant more than applause from civilian spectators who couldn't truly appreciate the subtleties of what they had witnessed. However, the sentinel continued, and something in his tone made Chen's confidence waver slightly. I wonder if traditional forms can adapt to modern realities. The threats we face today are quite different from those encountered by the masters who developed your techniques centuries ago. The courtyard grew quiet again. Other demonstrators who had been preparing to leave now stopped to listen. Chen felt all eyes on him, waiting for his response. This was clearly more than polite conversation. It was a challenge disguised as philosophical discussion. Respectfully, sir, Chen replied, drawing himself up to his full height. True martial arts are timeless. The human body hasn't changed in 500 years. The principles of leverage, timing, and distance remain constant. What worked against samurai swords will work against modern weapons. The sentinel nodded thoughtfully. An interesting perspective. Perhaps you would be willing to demonstrate this philosophy in a more practical application? Chen's heart began beating faster. Was the royal sentinel actually challenging him to a sparring match? The idea seemed impossible. Surely protocol would prevent such a thing during an official demonstration. But the way the man spoke, the way he positioned himself, everything suggested this was exactly what was happening. I would be honored to show the practical application of traditional karate, Chen said carefully, not wanting to appear either eager or reluctant. Though I should mention that I've been training for 45 years. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to demonstrate with one of your junior guards. The sentinel's almost smile returned. Thank you for your concern, Master Chen, but I believe I can handle myself adequately. Shall we say 3 minutes? Light contact only, of course. We wouldn't want any injuries during what is, after all, a job interview. The crowd began murmuring excitedly. This was clearly not part of the scheduled program, but no one seemed inclined to object. Palace officials whispered among themselves while the other martial artists formed a loose circle around the two men. Chen found himself in the center of attention in a way he hadn't expected. Chen removed his belt and retied it carefully, a ritual that helped him center his mind for combat. The sentinel made no such preparations. He simply stood relaxed, hands at his sides, looking more like he was waiting for a bus than preparing for a fight with a martial arts master. "Whenever you're ready, Master Chen," the sentinel said quietly. Chen had fought thousands of sparring matches over the decades. He knew how to read opponents, how to spot their favorite techniques in the first few seconds of engagement. But as he studied the Royal Sentinel, he found nothing to analyze. The man's stance revealed no preferences. His breathing gave no hints about his conditioning, and his eyes showed no intention. Chen decided to start conservatively. He approached with a traditional fighting stance, hands positioned for both offense and defense. He threw a controlled jab toward the sentinel's solar plexus, more to gauge reaction time than to actually land a significant blow. The sentinel wasn't there when the punch arrived. He had moved just enough to let Chen's fist pass harmlessly by, requiring minimal effort but perfect timing. Chen immediately followed with a low kick aimed at the sentinel's front leg, but again found nothing but air. For the next minute, Chen pressed forward with increasingly complex combinations. He threw punches and kicks that had defeated champions, used footwork that had puzzled masters, and employed timing that had taken decades to perfect. Each technique was flawless in execution, any one of them capable of ending a street fight instantly. None of them touched the Royal Sentinel. The man moved like smoke, always just out of reach but never appearing hurried or strained. He didn't block Chen's attacks, he simply wasn't where they landed. Sometimes he moved his entire body, sometimes just a single limb, but every evasion was minimal and perfectly calculated. Chen began to feel something he hadn't experienced in years: frustration. His techniques were working exactly as they should, but his opponent seemed to exist in a different space entirely. It was like trying to punch moonlight or kick a shadow. Halfway through the match, Chen decided to abandon caution. He launched into a full power combination that would have overwhelmed any normal opponent. His fists and feet moved in a blur of precise technique, each strike flowing into the next without pause. This was karate at its highest level, 45 years of training distilled into pure combat efficiency. The Royal Sentinel seemed to dance through the assault. His movements became more fluid, almost artistic in their elegance. He ducked under high punches, sidestepped kicks by millimeters, and occasionally moved forward when Chen expected him to retreat. Not once did he attempt a counterattack, but Chen began to realize this wasn't mercy. It was complete confidence. As the 3 minutes drew to a close, Chen found himself breathing heavily while the sentinel looked as fresh as when they started. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Chen, the legendary master who had never lost a fight, failed to land even a single clean technique on his opponent. The sentinel raised his hand slightly, and Chen immediately stopped his attack, recognizing the universal signal for the end of sparring. Both men bowed respectfully to each other, but Chen felt hollow inside. His bow was mechanical, performed from muscle memory while his mind struggled to process what had just happened. "Thank you for the demonstration, Master Chen," the sentinel said, and his tone held no mockery or condescension. "Your technique is indeed flawless, exactly as I expected from someone of your reputation." Chen managed to nod, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzing about what they had witnessed. The other martial artists looked at Chen with mixtures of sympathy and relief. Sympathy for his obvious defeat. Relief that they hadn't been the ones chosen to face the Royal Sentinel. As Chen prepared to leave, gathering his belongings with hands that trembled slightly, he caught sight of the sentinels speaking quietly with palace officials. Their conversation was too distant to overhear, but their occasional glances in his direction made the outcome clear. Walking back through the palace gardens that had seemed so welcoming just hours earlier, Chen felt decades of confidence crumbling around him. Every step reminded him of techniques that had failed, of a lifetime of training that had proven inadequate when it mattered most. The traditional forms that had always been his strength now felt like choreographed dances with no connection to real combat. The philosophical principles he had studied and taught suddenly seemed like pretty words meant to disguise the harsh reality that he had just experienced. For the first time in 45 years, Chen questioned everything he thought he knew about martial arts. Chen sat alone in his small apartment that evening, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The face looking back at him seemed older than it had that morning, worn down by more than just physical exhaustion. His hands, which had broken countless boards and defeated numerous opponents, now shook as he held his cup of tea. The apartment was modest but filled with the artifacts of a martial arts lifetime. Certificates and trophies covered every available surface, each one representing years of dedicated training and hard-won victories. Tournament medals hung from hooks on the wall, their metal surfaces catching the lamplight like small suns. Black and white photographs showed Chen in his younger days, receiving instruction from legendary masters whose names were spoken with reverence in dojos around the world. None of it mattered now. Every achievement felt hollow. Every accolade seemed to mock him with its irrelevance. Chen had built his entire identity around being a martial arts master, and in the space of 3 minutes, that identity had been shattered by a man who made defeating him look effortless. His students would arrive tomorrow expecting their usual lesson, looking up to him with the same respect and admiration they had always shown. How could he face them knowing that everything he taught them might be as useless as it had proven against the Royal Sentinel? How could he continue charging people money to learn techniques that couldn't touch a truly skilled opponent? Chen tried to analyze what had gone wrong. His techniques had been perfect, he was certain of that. His timing had been precise, his distance calculations accurate, and his power generation flawless. The problem wasn't with his execution of traditional karate principles. The problem seemed to be with the principles themselves. The Royal Sentinel had moved unlike anyone Chen had ever faced. There was no wasted motion, no telegraphing of intentions, no commitment to any particular fighting style. The man seemed to exist in a state of pure adaptability, responding to each attack with exactly the minimum effort required to avoid it. Chen had encountered skilled fighters before, but they all had patterns, preferences, and limitations that could be exploited with enough observation. The Sentinel had shown none of these human weaknesses. It was as if he had transcended the normal rules of combat entirely. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of the sparring match played over and over with different outcomes. In some dreams, Chen's techniques connected, proving his worth and validating his life's work. In others, the humiliation was even worse, with the Sentinel easily defeating him in front of larger crowds that laughed at his failure. Chen woke several times in cold sweats, his heart racing as if he were still in combat. The next morning brought his first group of students, a class of teenagers whose parents had enrolled them to learn discipline and self-defense. They arrived with their usual enthusiasm, chattering excitedly about techniques they had been practicing at home and movies they had seen featuring martial artists. "Sensei Chen, can you teach us that spinning kick like in the action movies?" asked Tommy, a 15-year-old who had been training for 6 months and still struggled with basic stances. Chen looked at the eager faces surrounding him and felt a wave of despair. These young people trusted him to prepare them for real-world situations, to give them skills that might save their lives someday. But how could he teach them anything useful when his own 45 years of training had proven worthless against a single opponent? "Today we will work on basic forms," Chen said quietly, falling back on the structured routine that had guided his teaching for decades. "Remember, perfect practice makes perfect performance." The words felt like lies in his mouth. Perfect performance according to whom? According to standards set by masters who had never faced anyone like the Royal Sentinel. According to tournament judges who awarded points for techniques that couldn't actually land against a skilled opponent. As his students moved through their kata, Chen found himself seeing the movements with new eyes. The blocks that were supposed to stop incoming attacks now looked slow and predictable. The strikes that were meant to end fights seemed to telegraph their intentions from miles away. The footwork that was supposed to provide superior positioning appeared clunky and limited compared to the fluid movement he had witnessed. "Sensei, is something wrong?" asked Sarah, one of his more perceptive students. "You seem distracted today." Chen realized he had been staring off into space while his students practiced. "Continue with your forms," he said, not answering her question directly. "Focus on making each movement perfect." But even as he said it, Chen wondered what perfection meant anymore. He had achieved what he thought was perfection, and it had crumbled like sand in his hands when tested against real skill. After class, Chen called his old friend Master Rodriguez, who ran a traditional kung fu school across town. They had known each other for 20 years, had trained together occasionally, and had always shared a mutual respect for each other's dedication to classical martial arts. "Miguel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," Chen said after the usual pleasantries. "Of course, my friend," What's troubling you? Chen described the encounter with the Royal Sentinel in detail, leaving nothing out. He explained how none of his techniques had connected, how effortless the Sentinel's evasions had appeared, and how completely outclassed he had felt throughout the entire match. Rodriguez listened without interrupting, occasionally making sympathetic sounds but offering no immediate commentary. When Chen finished his account, silence stretched between them for several long moments. "Have you considered," Rodriguez finally said carefully, "that perhaps this man represented a level of skill beyond what we typically encounter in our training?" "What do you mean?" Chen asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Most of us train against other traditional martial artists, Chen. We spar with people who move the way we move, who think the way we think about combat. We compete in tournaments with rules and structures that favor our particular approaches. But what if there are practitioners out there who have moved beyond these limitations?" Chen felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying our training is inadequate?" "I'm saying maybe we've been training to fight other traditional martial artists, not to face someone who has transcended traditional boundaries entirely. The Royal Sentinel sounds like he might represent something we haven't encountered before, a synthesis of techniques that goes beyond any single style." After hanging up, Chen sat in his empty dojo surrounded by equipment that suddenly seemed like museum pieces. The heavy bags hanging from chains looked like artifacts from a simpler time when strength and conditioning were enough. The wooden striking posts bore the marks of countless hours of conditioning. But now Chen wondered if he had been conditioning himself for the wrong type of combat entirely. The walls were lined with weapons, nunchaku, bow staff, sai, and tonfa, all traditional implements that Chen had mastered over the years. But when was the last time anyone had needed to defend themselves against an attacker wielding a medieval weapon? Had he spent decades preparing for battles that no longer existed? Chen picked up his worn training manual, its pages yellow with age and filled with his handwritten notes from decades of study. The techniques illustrated within had been tested in combat for centuries, proven effective by generations of masters. But proven against whom? Against other practitioners of similar styles using similar strategies and operating under similar assumptions about how fights should unfold. The Royal Sentinel had operated under no such assumptions. He had moved like someone who had studied every possible approach to combat, and then discarded the limitations inherent in each one. Where Chen had been bound by the requirements of traditional stances and prescribed techniques, the Sentinel had been free to adapt to any situation with perfect efficiency. For the first time in his adult life, Chen began to question whether everything he had built his identity around might be fundamentally flawed. 3 days after the palace demonstration, Chen received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar. One of the palace officials who had witnessed his humiliating encounter with the Royal Sentinel. "Master Chen, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but the Royal Sentinel has requested to speak with you privately. Would you be available to meet with him this afternoon?" Chen's stomach dropped. Was this some kind of follow-up humiliation? Perhaps the Sentinel wanted to offer him a position as a basic instructor for children. Or maybe he intended to explain in detail why Chen's approach to martial arts was outdated and ineffective. "Of course," Chen heard himself saying, despite every instinct telling him to decline. Where would he like to meet? "There's a small tea house near the palace called Golden Lotus. He said to tell you he'll be waiting at 2 o'clock, and that he hopes you'll give him the opportunity to explain some things that might interest you." Chen spent the next few hours in a state of nervous anticipation. He changed clothes 3 times, unsure whether to dress formally or casually for this mysterious meeting. Finally, he settled on simple dark pants and a plain white shirt, clothes that would allow him to move freely if the situation somehow turned physical again. The Golden Lotus Tea House was tucked away in a quiet alley, the kind of place locals knew about but tourists rarely discovered. It had the authentic atmosphere that came from decades of serving the same community, with worn wooden floors and mismatched furniture that somehow created a welcoming environment. The Royal Sentinel was already seated at a corner table when Chen arrived, wearing civilian clothes that made him look like any other professional meeting a colleague for afternoon tea. Without his uniform, he appeared younger and somehow less intimidating, though Chen could still sense the controlled power in the way he held himself. "Master Chen, thank you for coming," the Sentinel said, rising to bow respectfully. "Please sit." I've taken the liberty of ordering some jasmine tea. Chen sat carefully, studying the man across from him for any clues about the purpose of this meeting. The sentinel's manner was courteous and relaxed, showing no signs of the predatory alertness that had characterized him during their sparring match. I wanted to apologize for putting you in such an uncomfortable position the other day, the sentinel began, pouring tea for both of them with practiced precision. I realized that what happened might have been unsettling. You have nothing to apologize for, Chen replied stiffly. I agreed to the demonstration. The result simply showed the difference in our skill levels. The sentinel paused with his teacup halfway to his lips. Is that what you think happened? That I demonstrated superior skill? Chen looked at him in confusion. What else would you call it? You made my 45 years of training look worthless in 3 minutes. Your training isn't worthless. Master Chen, your technique was flawless. Better than most masters I've encountered anywhere in the world. But technique alone wasn't what you were facing. I don't understand. The sentinel set down his cup and leaned forward slightly. Tell me, what do you know about my background? Chen realized he knew nothing beyond the man's title. I assumed you had extensive martial arts training, obviously at a very high level. I do, but not in the way you might think. I didn't train in any single style for decades the way you did. Instead, I spent 15 years studying with masters from dozens of different disciplines. Karate, Kung Fu, Muay Thai, boxing, wrestling, judo, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, Krav Maga, and systems you've probably never heard of. Chen felt a spark of interest despite his wounded pride. 15 years across that many styles? Most people barely scratch the surface of one art in that time. Exactly. I never mastered any single style the way you mastered karate. But I learned something else. I learned how all these systems work together and, more importantly, how they work against each other. I studied not just techniques, but the underlying assumptions that each art makes about combat. The sentinel paused to sip his tea, giving Chen time to process this information. Every traditional martial art was developed to solve specific problems that existed at specific times in history. Karate was designed to help Okinawan farmers defend themselves against armored samurai. Boxing evolved for one-on-one duels between gentlemen. Wrestling developed for competitions with rules and referees. But what if you could step outside all those historical limitations? The sentinel continued. What if you could use the footwork of a boxer, the grappling awareness of a judoka, the striking angles of a karate master, and the tactical thinking of a modern soldier all at the same time? Chen began to understand what had happened during their sparring match. You weren't using any single style against me, correct? I was using whatever approach would be most effective against karate specifically. I knew that karate practitioners excel at linear attacks and defense, so I focused on circular movement. I knew you would expect certain ranges and timing, so I operated outside those expectations. I wasn't fighting as any particular style. I was fighting as someone who understood your style completely. The revelation was both illuminating and devastating. Chen had spent decades perfecting his art, but in doing so, he had also created predictable patterns that could be exploited by someone with broader tactical knowledge. This is why traditional arts are becoming less effective in modern contexts, the sentinel explained. It's not that the techniques are bad, many of them are excellent. But the world has changed. Information travels instantly now. Fighters can study video footage of any technique they want to understand. The isolation that allowed traditional arts to develop their unique approaches no longer exists. Chen stared into his teacup, watching the leaves swirl in patterns that reminded him of the sentinel's movements during their match. So everything I've learned is obsolete? Not obsolete, incomplete. Your karate foundation is actually excellent. Your body mechanics are perfect, your timing is exceptional, and your mental discipline is something most modern fighters never develop. But you've been training to fight other karate practitioners, or at least people who fight in ways that karate was designed to counter. The sentinel leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. The reason I wanted to meet with you, Master Chen, is because I believe you could adapt. You have something most fighters never develop: true mastery of fundamental principles. If you were willing to expand your perspective, you could become far more dangerous than you are now. Chen looked up sharply. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we train together. Not as teacher and student, but as practitioners exploring how traditional mastery can evolve to meet modern realities. You could learn to apply your karate skills in contexts you've never considered. And I could learn from the depth of understanding that only comes from decades of dedicated practice. The offer hung in the air between them, like an unexpected lifeline. Chen felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. Part of him wanted to cling to the purity of traditional karate, to reject any suggestion that his life's work needed modification. But a larger part recognized the wisdom in what the sentinel was proposing. Would this mean abandoning karate entirely? Chen asked quietly. Just the opposite. It would mean understanding karate so completely that you could use it in any situation, against any opponent, with any set of constraints. True mastery isn't about perfect execution of predetermined techniques. It's about perfect adaptation to whatever reality presents. Chen thought about his students, about the responsibility he felt to prepare them for real-world situations. He thought about the decades he had spent believing he understood combat, only to discover how narrow his understanding had actually been. Where would we begin? He asked. The training began the following week in a private gymnasium that the Royal Sentinel had access to through his position. The space was unlike any dojo Chen had ever seen. Instead of traditional mats and mirrors, it contained equipment from every conceivable martial art. Heavy bags hung next to makiwara boards, wrestling mats shared space with boxing rings, and weapons from dozens of cultures lined the walls. Before we begin any physical training, the Sentinel said on their first session, I want you to understand something crucial. We're not here to replace your karate with something else. We're here to discover how your karate can evolve. Chen nodded, though he still felt nervous about the entire undertaking. Everything familiar was about to be challenged, and at his age, learning new approaches felt more difficult than it had in his youth. The Sentinel began by having Chen demonstrate his basic techniques exactly as he had always practiced them. But instead of practicing in empty air, Chen was asked to perform them against different types of resistance and in different contexts. Throw your reverse punch, the Sentinel instructed, but imagine your opponent is much taller than you're used to. Chen adjusted his angle slightly, raising his target area to accommodate the hypothetical height difference. The adjustment felt natural, drawing on principles he had always known but rarely applied. Now throw it as if your opponent is a grappler who wants to close distance immediately after you attack. This time, Chen found himself modifying his follow-through and recovery, maintaining better balance in case he needed to defend against a takedown attempt. Again, the adjustment felt logical, an extension of karate principles rather than a departure from them. They spent the first several sessions exploring how traditional karate techniques could be modified for different opponents, different environments, and different tactical situations. Chen began to realize that his art contained far more adaptability than he had ever explored. The kata you've practiced for decades aren't just choreographed sequences, the Sentinel explained during one session. They're encyclopedias of combat principles encoded in movement, but most practitioners never learn to decode them properly. Chen thought about the forms he had practiced thousands of times, movements that had become as natural as breathing. What do you mean by decoding them? Watch this. The Sentinel moved through the opening sequence of a kata that Chen knew well, but his interpretation was completely different. Where Chen had always seen blocks and strikes, the Sentinel demonstrated throws and joint locks. Where Chen saw linear movement, the Sentinel showed circular applications. Every movement in your traditional forms has multiple applications, the Sentinel continued. The masters who created these kata were encoding dozens of different techniques into each sequence, but over time, most schools settled on teaching only one interpretation. Chen felt like he was rediscovering karate for the first time. Movements he had performed mechanically for decades suddenly revealed hidden depths of meaning. A simple rising block could be a strike to the jaw, a throw, or a joint manipulation depending on the context and timing. The physical training gradually became more challenging as Chen learned to apply his techniques against opponents who moved differently than traditional karate practitioners. The Sentinel would switch between fighting like a boxer, then like a wrestler, then like a Muay Thai fighter, forcing Chen to adapt his responses accordingly. At first, Chen struggled badly. His muscle memory kept expecting traditional attack patterns, and when faced with different approaches, his responses were often inappropriate or ineffective. But gradually, his body began to learn new patterns of recognition and response. Your body already knows how to move properly. the sentinel observed after Chen successfully defended against a wrestling takedown using modified karate footwork. We're just teaching it to recognize new situations where that proper movement applies. The breakthrough came during their third week of training. Chen was sparring against the sentinel, who was fighting in a style that mixed boxing and kickboxing. For the first time since their initial encounter at the palace, Chen managed to land a clean technique, a perfectly timed counterpunch that slipped past the sentinel's guard and connected solidly with his solar plexus. Both men stopped immediately, looking at each other with surprise. Chen had thrown a traditional karate reverse punch, but he had set it up using footwork borrowed from boxing and timing learned from defending against kicks. "There," the sentinel said with genuine satisfaction. "That's what I was hoping to see. You didn't abandon karate. You used karate principles with enhanced tactical awareness." Chen felt a surge of excitement unlike anything he had experienced in years. The technique had felt natural and familiar, but also more effective than anything he had ever thrown before. He was still using the skills he had spent decades developing, but now they were informed by a broader understanding of how fighting actually worked. Over the following weeks, Chen's confidence began to rebuild, but it was a different kind of confidence than he had possessed before. Instead of the rigid certainty that came from believing his way was the only correct way, he developed a flexible confidence based on understanding principles that could adapt to any situation. The sentinel introduced him to concepts from other martial arts, but always through the lens of how they could enhance his existing karate foundation. Chen learned the relaxed movement of Tai Chi, but applied it to make his karate techniques more deceptive. He studied the aggressive forward pressure of Muay Thai, but used it to make his karate combinations more overwhelming. Most importantly, he learned to see patterns in how different fighters moved and thought. Boxers had certain habits, wrestlers had others, and traditional martial artists like himself had their own predictable tendencies. By understanding these patterns, Chen could anticipate what opponents would do and position himself to take advantage. "You're learning to fight the person, not just the style," the sentinel observed during one of their sessions. "Every individual fighter has personal habits that go beyond their formal training. Reading those habits is more important than knowing their techniques." Chen began to understand that his original defeat hadn't been a failure of karate itself, but a failure of perspective. He had been so focused on executing perfect techniques that he had forgotten the most basic principle of combat: adaptation to your opponent's specific strengths and weaknesses. The transformation extended beyond physical techniques. Chen found himself approaching problems differently in his daily life, looking for multiple solutions instead of assuming the first answer that came to mind was necessarily the best one. His teaching began to evolve as well, though he was careful to maintain the traditional foundation that gave his students their technical excellence. During their 2-month mark of training together, the sentinel made an unexpected proposal. "I think you're ready for a real test, Master Chen. Not against me this time, but against someone who represents the kind of modern fighter you might actually encounter." Chen felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety, but this time it was mixed with curiosity rather than pure dread. "What did you have in mind?" "There's a mixed martial arts gym across town where some very skilled fighters train. Not professional level, but serious amateurs who compete regularly. They represent the kind of well-rounded modern combatants that traditional martial artists often struggle against." The idea both excited and terrified Chen. MMA fighters were exactly the kind of opponents that had made traditional martial artists question the effectiveness of their training. They trained specifically to fight against all styles, and their conditioning was typically superior to that of most traditional practitioners. Would this be a formal sparring session? Light contact, controlled environment, just like our training here. But these fighters won't know your background or make any accommodations for traditional techniques. They'll fight the way they always fight, and you'll need to adapt accordingly. Chen thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. 2 months ago, the idea of facing an MMA fighter would have filled him with nothing but dread. Now, while he was still nervous, he felt genuinely curious about how his evolved understanding would perform against this type of opponent. "When do we go?" he asked. The following evening found Chen standing in an MMA gym that smelled of sweat and determination. The space was filled with young fighters working on various aspects of their craft, some grappling on mats, others hitting heavy bags, and a few sparring in a caged octagon that dominated the center of the room. Chen felt out of place in his traditional GI among fighters wearing shorts and tank tops, but the sentinel had assured him that his clothing was perfectly appropriate for what they were planning to do. The fighter they had arranged to spar with was named Marcus, a 28-year-old who had been training MMA for 6 years. He was respectful but clearly curious about why he was being asked to spar with an older traditional martial artist. "I'll go easy on you," Marcus said as they prepared to begin, and Chen could hear genuine concern in his voice. "Just let me know if you want to stop at any time." Chen appreciated the young man's consideration, but part of him was eager to show that traditional martial arts, properly understood, were far from obsolete. The sparring began. 6 months after his humiliating defeat at the palace, Chen stood in his dojo preparing for the evening's advanced class. The space looked the same as always. Traditional equipment, ceremonial weapons on the walls, and photographs of legendary masters watching over everything. But Chen himself had changed profoundly, and his teaching had evolved along with his understanding. His students began arriving, the same dedicated practitioners who had trained with him for years. But tonight, Chen had something special planned, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their art. "Sensei, are we working on the new kata tonight?" asked David, one of his black belt students who had been training for 8 years. "Actually, David, I want to try something different tonight. I want you all to spar against opponents who fight nothing like karate practitioners." Chen had arranged for several fighters from Marcus's MMA gym to visit his dojo. The collaboration had grown out of mutual respect and curiosity. The MMA fighters wanted to understand traditional techniques better, while Chen's students needed to test their skills against different fighting approaches. The contrast was immediately apparent when the MMA fighters arrived. Where Chen's students moved with the formal precision that came from years of traditional training, the visiting fighters carried themselves with a more casual confidence that came from regular competitive pressure. "I want everyone to approach this with an open mind," Chen addressed both groups as they gathered in the center of the dojo. "We're not here to prove which style is better. We're here to learn from each other and expand our understanding of what works in different contexts." The first pairing was Tommy, the teenager who had been training for 2 years, against a young woman named Lisa, who had been doing MMA for about the same length of time. Chen watched carefully as they began to spar, noting how Tommy's traditional approach initially confused Lisa, but how quickly she adapted to his patterns. What pleased Chen most was seeing Tommy begin to modify his techniques mid-fight. Instead of rigidly sticking to textbook karate responses, he started using the principles Chen had been teaching about adaptation and tactical awareness. By the end of their session, Tommy was successfully applying karate techniques in ways that Lisa couldn't easily predict or counter. "That felt completely different from sparring with other karate students," Tommy said afterward, breathing heavily but grinning with excitement. "I had to think about everything differently." Chen nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the point. Your karate techniques are solid, but now you're learning to apply them against opponents who don't move the way you expect. This makes you a more complete fighter." The evening continued with various pairings, each one presenting new challenges and learning opportunities. Chen's advanced students discovered that their traditional techniques could indeed work against modern fighters, but only when applied with proper tactical understanding and adaptability. Sarah, his most senior student, found herself successfully defending against grappling attempts using modified karate footwork and distance management. David learned to use his kata-trained precision to find openings that his MMA opponent left exposed. Each exchange revealed new possibilities for how traditional techniques could evolve without losing their essential character. The Royal Sentinel arrived near the end of the session, having promised to observe this experiment in cross-training. He watched quietly as Chen's students worked with their visiting partners, occasionally nodding with apparent approval at what he was seeing. "How do you think they're progressing?" the Sentinel asked Chen during a brief break. "Better than I expected," Chen replied honestly. "It's taken them time to overcome their initial conditioning. But once they started thinking tactically instead of just technically, the improvement was rapid." "And how are you feeling about this new direction?" Chen considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, I thought I understood martial arts completely. I believed that perfect technique was enough, that traditional methods were inherently superior to modern approaches. The encounter with you showed me how limited that thinking was. He paused, watching his students continue their training with obvious enthusiasm. What I've learned is that traditional arts like karate contain incredible depth and wisdom, but only if we're willing to understand them as living systems rather than museum pieces. The techniques our predecessors developed were solutions to specific problems. Our job isn't to preserve those solutions unchanged, but to understand the underlying principles well enough to develop new solutions for new problems. The sentinel smiled, the same almost expression that Chen had first seen at the palace demonstration. That's a very mature perspective, Master Chen, and your students seem to be embracing this approach well. They trust me to guide them toward effective training, Chen said. My responsibility is to give them skills that will actually work when they need them, not just techniques that look impressive in demonstrations. As the evening concluded and both groups of fighters said their respectful goodbyes, Chen felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His dojo was still clearly a karate school. The traditional elements remained strong and the respect for classical techniques was unchanged. But now it was also something more, a place where ancient wisdom met modern realities. Over the following months, word spread through the martial arts community about the unique training environment Chen had created. Fighters from various backgrounds began visiting his dojo, not to learn karate specifically, but to participate in the cross-training sessions that had become a regular feature of his advanced classes. Chen's reputation evolved as well. He was no longer known simply as a traditional karate master, but as an instructor who had found a way to bridge the gap between classical martial arts and modern combat effectiveness. Students came to him specifically because they wanted training that honored traditional principles while preparing them for real-world situations. The Royal Sentinel continued to train with Chen regularly, their relationship evolving from teacher-student to something more like research partners. Together, they explored questions that neither could answer alone. How could traditional techniques be adapted for modern contexts? What principles remained constant across all effective martial arts? How could classical training methods be modified to produce fighters who could handle any situation? 1 year after their first encounter at the palace, Chen received another phone call from the palace officials. This time, however, it wasn't about a job interview. The Royal Guard wanted to send some of their junior members to train at Chen's dojo, recognizing that his unique approach to martial arts education could benefit their personnel. It seems you found your calling after all, the sentinel observed. When Chen told him about the request, Chen nodded, thinking back to the confident man who had walked into the palace demonstration, believing he had nothing left to learn. That person seemed like a stranger now, someone whose understanding of martial arts had been dangerously incomplete despite decades of training. I thought mastery meant knowing everything, Chen reflected. Now I understand that real mastery means being able to learn anything. The techniques I spent 45 years perfecting weren't useless. They were just incomplete without the broader understanding of how to apply them. He looked around his dojo, seeing it with eyes that appreciated both its traditional foundation and its evolution towards something more comprehensive. This feels like the beginning of my martial arts journey, not the end of it. The man who had once believed his confidence could never be shaken had discovered something far more valuable than unquestioned certainty. The confidence that comes from knowing you can adapt to whatever challenges arise, armed with principles deep enough to guide you through any situation.